Now, before I even say what it is, you already know, this is a Jeep Wrangler. This is the undisputed off-road king, and it has been for decades. It's the kind of no-nonsense, no-frills vehicle that makes you want to put on your dad's old flannel jacket, get your John Deere hat, and go out and find the mud. Now, the best part about the Wrangler is it also lets you put the roof down and let the sun shine in. Now, when I mentioned at the office that nothing can compete with this thing, Dan right away said that he had a vehicle in mind that he thinks can stack up against the Wrangler, and he's on his way here now, and I can't wait for him to arrive because I have no clue what he's bringing. Come on, Dan. You didn't bring this thing to sit next to my Wrangler and really compare them, did you?
This is a Range Rover Evoque convertible, and it's the kind of vehicle that makes you want to put on your finest pastel-colored polo for a day of fun in the sun. It doesn't hurt that it's got all kinds of off-road goodies that make it capable out on the trail. And unlike your mall crawler over here, at least this thing knows how to stand out in a crowd.
Oh yeah, no chance this thing can keep up with the Wrangler, man. What are you doing, going to get like crumpets and high tea or something?
Buddy, that thing is Bush League and this thing is Ivy League.
Let's go prove it then, man. Let's hit the trail. Try to follow me.
So if you haven't guessed by now, this isn't a straight up comparison of the Evoque convertible and the Jeep Wrangler. That would be absolutely ridiculous. Instead, this is a comparison of their capabilities and their fundamentals. I mean, Steve challenged me to find a vehicle that could go head to head with the likes of the Jeep Wrangler, and the prerequisites were that it had to be a 4x4, pretty capable out on the trail, and have a top that could be put down so you can soak in the sun when you're out here having some fun. And that's exactly what this Evoque convertible does. No, it doesn't have the sheer off-road abilities of that Wrangler, but it's pretty damn close. Don't forget, this thing is a Land Rover, and that means there's a lot of heritage on the line here. They're not going to build something just for show. This has to be able to withstand some of the rigors that you encounter out on the trail. And trust me, this thing has that baked right into it from the very start. It also has Land Rover's terrain response system that tailors everything from the four-wheel drive system to the transmission and throttle response to tackle different conditions out here on the trail. Anything from rocks to mud to grass to sand to snow, you name it. All you have to do is hit a switch here on the console and it'll do it all on its own. You don't have to worry about it. It also includes things like hill descent control, so that when you're going down a steeper slope out on the trail, all you have to worry about is avoiding obstacles. It handles the rest. If you want to speed up, all you do is use the cruise control buttons on the steering wheel to add or subtract speed as required.
Yeah, beyond what Dan said, this comparison is really kind of analog versus digital. This Jeep has all of the old school things that makes an off-roader, like 10 inches of ground clearance, over 40 degrees of approach angle, you know, big shocks with lots of wheel travel to eat stuff up. Unlike the Range Rover, which is, you know, all tricks and gizmos and different electronics that help you get through the mud, this Jeep is just old school with some big beefy tires. So I've got a few things planned today. You know, nothing too crazy, but I think we're gonna push that Evoque. So Dan's following me. We're gonna go hit them and see how the Range Rover does. So the first thing we're gonna show Dan how to do is run through the mud, and it looks a little something like this.
first hurdle we encountered out here is this mud pit, and to be honest with you, I didn't really think it was going to be that big of a deal. Yeah, it's pretty deep and there's a lot of water and a lot of mud, but it didn't seem like it was going to be that much of a challenge for this thing. But I can tell you I was definitely wrong, and that's where the Wrangler's increased approach and departure angles definitely come in handy. As soon as we got into that pit, the front bumper had all kinds of trouble. In fact, the bumper actually broke a little bit. Some of the clips busted off and the license plate came right off as soon as we were cresting the first little mogul in the middle of the mud pit. It was definitely a disappointment considering just how easily this thing overcame all of that mud that we threw at it. It wasn't a problem except for the tires, which obviously are all-terrains and they're not really up to the task of handling this kind of surface out here, but overall it was pretty good with just a little bit of wheel spin.
So before we ran through that mud pit, Dan and I both had to put our roofs back on, and that's a clear advantage for the Evoque. As you can see here, putting on the roof to the Wrangler is kind of confusing, and there's lots of little tricky parts with the zipper and the Velcro, and honestly, it kind of takes two people to do it. Unlike the Evoque, which is just touch a button and away she goes. But once that little inconvenience was out of the way, it's no contest. This Wrangler just crawls through the mud. And here on our Chief Special Edition, we actually get BF Goodrich mud terrain tires. And you know, needless to say, these things absolutely grab in the mud. Okay, so the Evoque made it through the mud. It kind of lost one of its pieces, but it did make it through there. And if you were to secure that bumper, I mean, it would go through that mud pit all day. So we're gonna go do a little bit more of a technical section now and see how the Rangey keeps up. So picking my way down the rock hill, the biggest compliment I can give to the Wrangler is I just didn't have to worry. I didn't have to worry about my clearances. I mean, none of those rocks were all that big, but even still, I'm sure Dan in that Evoque was sweating the whole time coming down there, and I even had to jump out and spot him through at one point. In the Wrangler, you just go for it, and you know, 9 times out of 10, everything is perfectly fine. So besides these clearances, which are pretty great, the Wrangler also gives you a nice high seating position, and I can see the fender flares quite clearly, and because I know where the tire is at the fender flare, you know, it gives you a really good sense for where this vehicle is around you. And the Wrangler's really not all of that big, even though this is a 4-door unlimited model. It just feels like it fits nice. It fits like a glove around you when you're off-road, and it feels quite maneuverable. And believe it or not, this Wrangler actually has a better turning circle than the Evoque does.
Otherwise, it was pretty smooth sailing out here. The hill descent that he had planned for us wasn't a problem at all, and we just used the hill descent control to easily work our way down without too much trouble. Now, this thing does give up a couple inches of ground clearance to the Wrangler, and that was a bit of a problem, but you can remove the bumper if you so choose. Now, I will warn you, it's definitely a challenging process. A lot of steps, a lot of wires, and a lot of clips. It's not something I would want to do out here, but you can do it if you need a little bit more of an approach angle and a little bit more clearance for some of the rocks you encounter out here on the trail. Truthfully, my biggest pet peeve about the Evoque convertible isn't the lack of ground clearance or the independent suspension or any of that stuff. What it is the stupid proximity sensors. I totally understand why they're there for maneuvering around parking lots and stuff like that, but out here on the trail, they are a huge pain in the ass. And the worst part is you can't actually turn them off. Oh sure, the button on the screen says you can turn them off and that they are off. But as soon as you come close to a little bit of tall grass, it starts beeping like a slot machine. It's absolutely atrocious when you're trying to focus on the task at hand and all you hear is this beeping noise and it won't go away. It's enough to drive you absolutely mad. So now that I have that rant out of my system, let's talk about the good. And it starts with this drivetrain. It's a 2-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it's got 240 horsepower to go along with about 250 pound-feet of torque. And that's plenty both out here on the trail and more importantly, out on the road. And that's the biggest advantage this thing has over the Wrangler. We all know exactly how a Wrangler drives out on the road, but this thing drives so much like a car. It's so unbelievably quiet and smooth and comfortable. I absolutely love it. And you know, you could cross-shop this thing with something like a base Mercedes-Benz C-Class Cabrio or a BMW 4 Series drop top and come out happy either way you go. It's got everything those cars have with the added bonus of a little bit more ride height and a little bit taller seating position. Now, it does give up a little bit of trunk space to both of those cars, but that's neither here nor there. The 9-speed automatic transmission is awesome. It never misses a shift. And this thing has a brake-based torque vectoring system to make it just a little bit more engaging when you're pushing it through a corner. It also has its wheels pushed really close to the corners, which means that turn-in response is super sharp, and it makes this thing surprisingly agile. Overall, I'd say it's a pretty strong package.
All right, so you know what? It did take Dan a second set of eyes, but the Range Rover definitely made it through mostly unscathed. And again, we're not necessarily trying to prove how awesome that thing is off-road, but it does prove that there's another option out there. If you want to be able to do this, have the sunshine coming into your car, and you want to do a little bit of off-roading, that Evoque convertible is not a horrible choice, but it's no Wrangler. Driving the Wrangler on the road, I can describe that in one word: terrible. This thing's just a big box driving down the road. The wind blows it all over the place. The steering's really loose. It takes a lot of work to keep it tracking straight. You know what? I just don't understand buying a Wrangler to drive it on the road every day. If you're gonna do what we're doing, getting out here in the mud and the rocks, this thing is totally worth it because of how good it is off-road. But if you're not off-roading, the on-road compromises, it's just not worth it. Now, making this comparison even more oddball, I have the 6-speed manual here in this Wrangler. I just wanted to talk about it real quick. So far, it seems pretty decent. The clutch engagement point is pretty high up in the travel, but it's a pretty defined engagement point, which is nice for off-roading. It's not too sharp, but it's also not too soft. It's that nice middle ground so you can kind of work the clutch. And then as for the shifter, you know, it's long, it's kind of loose. The gates are kind of big, but it does have a nice notch as you pull it down into gear. And overall, it's a fairly decent manual. All right, well, you certainly didn't win today, but I will concede that the Evoque convertible can hang out there on the trail.
And that's the point of this thing. No, it's not going to go everywhere the Wrangler can, but it's definitely capable out here on the trail, and it can have all kinds of fun with the top down.
Yeah, you're right.
And I'll tell you this much, one advantage it has is at least I'll be comfortable driving this thing home.
You're going home? I'm going back to the trail, man. Let's get going.